In the journalism profession, neutrality and objectivity is often an oath that any practitioner of the profession agrees they must uphold in doing their job. To the layman, this means a number of things. That a journalist cannot take sides in their reporting, that they must be fair, that they must be accurate, include all the available facts in their work, and help the audience understand the fullest possible picture on any given issue, that they must not show bias or have a conflict of interest. For instance, if a former soldier or military affiliate of a country becomes a reporter, and say the country they once served is prosecuting a war, that reporter should at the very least declare their affiliation or come under closer scrutiny in their work. Or here's a less complicated example. If you interview a banana seller who's looking to make a sale, and you ask them whether this harvest bananas taste good, presumably you're getting only one answer.
Thank you very much, Academy. We made this film for all the journalists who have and continue to hold the powerful accountable, and for the survivors whose courage and will to overcome is really an inspiration. Is all we have to do. Make sure this never happens again.
When it comes to Israel's actions in Palestine over the last few years, in fact for decades now, it seems Western media, particularly in the UK and the US, which are our focus today, cannot agree on those once cardinal principles of journalism anymore. The United Nations last week announced what Israel has maintained is self-defense actually amounts to genocide. The pronouncement could not have come as a shock to many. Through the statements of Israeli public officials themselves expressing genocidal intent, the findings of international NGOs like Amnesty International, international humanitarian law experts, genocide scholars, some of them Israeli, doctors, Palestinian journalists at the risk of death. Many have known this to be true.
Good morning, everyone. This is Bisan from Gaza. It's the day 23 of continuous bombing. I'm smiling because I'm alive.
But apparently not mainstream outlets of record like the BBC or the New York Times. Not when the so-called Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry announced that over 60,000 Palestinians, most of them children, had died. A toll now considered conservative by many experts, as infrastructure used to keep score of the killed had been bombarded or destroyed by Israel's army.
65,000 is the number of Palestinians ascertained killed, including of which 75% are women and children. In fact, we shall start thinking of 680,000 because this is the number that some scholars and scientists claim being the real death toll in Gaza.
Not when the Israeli finance minister Bezalel Smotrich said publicly, within a few months, Gaza will be totally destroyed. The Gaza citizens will be concentrated in the south. They will be totally despairing, understanding that there's no hope and nothing to look for in Gaza, and will be looking for a location to begin a new life in other places. Or not when he said again that the Gaza Strip could be a real estate bonanza and is in talk to the US about dividing up the territory after the war.
לאיך הדבר הזה הופך לבוננזה של נדל"ן, אני לא צוחק, מחזיר את עצמו. אגב, אני התחלתי משא ומתן עם האמריקאים, ואני אומר את זה לא בצחוק עכשיו.
Mainstream media outlets in the UK and the US have in some cases underreported or downplayed statements like this in their coverage, betraying the cardinal principle of fairness and accuracy. They've employed different standards in their language when talking about Palestinians and Israelis. Israelis are described in active language like massacred, killed, or attacked. The perpetrator is often included in the headline. When Palestinians passively die, it's not usually clear who exactly killed them. Usually, it's the Israeli army. Now that it appears beyond reasonable doubt, now that we have to say genocide, today we examine the Western media's role, responsibility, and some might argue complicity in today's current state of affairs. Welcome to this week's episode of Insularity. I am Ayede Jirosinwa, the Africa editor here. Joining me today is Lila Hassan, an award-winning independent investigative journalist who has worked with a number of these outlets and has experienced this crisis of objectivity firsthand across different newsrooms. She reports and investigates, amongst others, human rights and international law frameworks, extremism and counter-extremism narratives and policies. Lila has won just about every important and prestigious award in journalism in the West, from the Pulitzer to a Peabody to a George Polk Award. She taught and teaches journalism at Columbia Journalism School and the Northwestern University in Qatar, respectively. I could not think of a better person to have this conversation with. In light of the topic at hand, I feel the need to disclose a few things. First, I am not neutral. It is my and openDemocracy's position that the theme must be called by its name. Israel is, as we speak, committing genocide, overseeing the intentional extermination of Palestinians using the attacks by Hamas on October 7th as a pretext. We believe this is fact. The second thing I need to disclose is that the title of this episode was initially Now That We Can Say Genocide. But after my conversation with Lila, who made a compelling point for a change, it became Now That We Have to Say Genocide. And we will start our special episode here today in illuminating how language by the press makes a world of difference.
I love the title of this episode because it's so clever, now that we can say it, as if, we need permission, now that we can say it, it's something that I don't want to correct it, but it's something that I would like to comment on, which is we have to say it. There is no more room left to doubt that this is a genocide. Every single body in the world has determined that this is a genocide. There are genocide experts and scholars that have determined this. There are Israeli genocide expert scholars that have determined this. Israeli nonprofit organizations and human rights organizations have determined that this is a genocide. So now that we have to say it because we've exhausted every other means of denying it. Do you know what this means? This means we should have been saying it. Not just that we can now say genocide, we should have been saying genocide. We have neglected from saying genocide. Now we have to say it.
The United Nations Commission of Inquiry has released a landmark report on Israel's actions in Gaza. It's found that Israel is committing 4 of 5 acts of genocide.
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 Genocide. Genocide.
Genocide. Genocide.
Genocide.
Genocide.
Genocide.
Genocide. Genocide.
Genocide.
Genocide.
I think my very first question is like at the very start, when we've first engaged each other, which was probably November 2023, just a month after Hamas attack on Israel. You had said even then you're already using like words that people are only now getting around to 2 years later. And, you had said to me as well, like, obviously editors will sort of like disagree with you or say like it was too early or just like don't take it seriously enough. And I was curious, how did you, this thing that people are just not realizing 2 years after, how did you come to that conclusion for yourself in your work, in your reporting?
Yeah, it's complicated. I think I come to it with a little bit more of an understanding of what these terms mean. Before I was ever a journalist, I worked in the human rights field. I worked in human rights investigations, what systemic and countrywide abuses look like on a mass scale. And with the question of Palestine, it had been ruled years before October 7th ever happened that Palestine was subject to apartheid and Israel was committing the crime of apartheid. And so if a country that's currently in this state, it's not difficult to believe that the next step of oppression could be a genocide or could be ethnic cleansing if over the last 10 years we've seen annexation after annexation of Palestinian land. So that's one. It became really clear to me that we were in a new chapter of violence pretty quickly because the stakes that were being waged against Palestinians was also quite high. From October 7th, from the attack immediately afterwards, there was a siege on aid, food, water, electricity, communications. There was a mass displacement order of 1.3 million people from the north to the south. And this is such old news at this point and kind of pales in comparison to the crimes we've seen since. But these were all incredibly drastic moves to make within the span of less than a week. And so to see this, to witness that was quite clearly a huge abuse against people that I don't think was taken seriously enough, which is why I was so adamant about using those words. There was enough conversation as well, because I started reporting right away. There was enough conversations from human rights lawyers, from experts, from those that have been watching the situation in Palestine for their entire careers that saw the same thing. So it's not just a conclusion that I came to based on my background, which I no longer am a part of that industry. It was also very much a conversation among the people that could determine that these were crimes that we were about to witnessing. I think something that we've grappled with as a collective was really, and then we're still grappling with it now, is when do we use the terms? Is it after the crime has been done? Is it while it's being committed? Is it after somebody admits to it? When do these terms come into play? I think our job as journalists, and why I was so insistent that the strongest of terms be used for the strongest of crimes, was because we have impact. We have impact. People are turning to us. People are looking at us for what's going on. And if we were to minimize these crimes into something as simple as like Israel's retaliation, we are not capturing the full scope of it. So to answer another part of your question, which is what's the pushback I faced pretty early on, because I was, quite strong in my stances and my understanding of what was going on. It wasn't that I was trying to push a narrative. It was that I was trying to push truly capturing what was going on. I was told pretty bluntly not to use the word genocide. That's not something we can use yet, is what I heard, which kind of is why I brought up that question of like, well, when do we use it? And if we were to make any sort of strong allegations against Israel, to make sure that we had a very robust source or report or international body that was using that words instead of us. But what I found really alarming was that by November, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was already saying that the Palestinian people were at grave risk of genocide. And that's only a month later, and still that word is not being used. That word can only now be used today, and we're 2 years into what is now a genocide. So, yeah, it's a big question mark for me still of how that happened and why that happened.
Something said about the pushback, and this is for the benefit of I guess, the ordinary average audience who doesn't know how sort of quote unquote journalism works. Let's say you do a report on this and then you file something that you include those words in based on your reporting, based on your sources, based on expert sources, based on your own background. What is the editor's rationale for saying, like, what do they actually say to you? Like, how do they break it down or justify why they can't use that word yet based on everything that you put on the page?
Yeah, well, so one thing, and this is something that I agree with in terms of the journalistic process, which is our job as journalists is not to make the conclusions. That's up to the experts. That is up to doctors if we're having a medical story. It is up to teachers if it's an education story. It's up to those in the position and the community that knows and understands deeply what is going on to make those conclusions for us. It's our job to convey that conclusion that they've made. So the experts that I was speaking to in human rights, in international law, in international humanitarian law, in humanitarian aid sectors, were all noticing an unprecedented wave of violence and kind of saw what was coming, could make these predictions. And what I found was that editors were quite allergic to these predictions, and they were quite allergic to these terms because at the time, I don't know if you remember, so many people were being fired for using any sort of condemnation or criticism against Israel. There was a lot of hesitancy in whether or not we should be going in so strong with this kind of language. Mind you, I'm a freelancer, so this isn't something that I found across, in my immediate team. This is something that I found across the board as I was pitching stories and as I was publishing. There were very few outlets that were, quote unquote, willing to go there. And I think it had to do so much with the atmosphere of intimidation that people were feeling, because mind you, we're talking about really, really high attention people from Hollywood and academia and fields that were in everybody's view getting fired and getting reprimanded and having their fundings removed and being doxxed and being chased after by Israeli trolls online. And so it kind of was a very intimidating environment. So the safer, more conservative action that editors were taking was to not go that route of further fueling whatever kind of retaliation could happen. The problem with that is that you started to kind of silence the voices of the experts that could speak to the situation of what was ethnic cleansing and what was genocide. Because if we were to do stories now, we could so clearly look back at what was going on and say that, yeah, that was the beginning of what we're seeing now, which is the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Gaza. But it did take bravery to use these terms for editors to say, okay, let's do it because the experts are saying that because that's what we're being warned. There just wasn't that willingness. And mind you, just something that I really feel like is important to add, when it comes to elections, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to medicine, there is no fear in journalists for making predictions, for airing the predictions of experts and people who expect trends to rise or fall. But it is very much something that they were not willing to go with when it came to human rights.
Well, that's a really important point. We're going to segue, well, not quite a segue, but I'm going to read you it's a bit long. It's a long quote by A.G. Salzberger, the chairman of the New York Times Company and publisher of the New York Times. He wrote an op-ed, I believe, for Columbia Journalism Review a couple of years ago, 2023, I think. And I paraphrase it in part, in which he said, there are some moral issues that we as a society have rightly come to view as settled and beyond reasonable debate. Racism is wrong. Women deserve equal rights. People shouldn't be tortured. At the same time, there are many related questions society is debating, and independent journalism must explore. Should race be a factor in college admissions? Under what circumstances should abortion be allowed? Independent journalism should err on the side of treating areas of serious political contest as open, unsettled, and need a further inquiry. Basically, as a way to say, if we haven't, as a society, agreed at something, concluded on something, journalism cannot preempt that. Is how I understood that quote, right? Which sort of speaks to this, is since we cannot all agree that this is genocide, journalism shouldn't say it's genocide or lean on one side or the other, because it was conceived, it could be perceived as picking a side, right? Presumably, I don't think you think Israel's actions in Palestine are opened, unsettled, or need a further inquiry. But for you, why do you think the rest of the larger Western media does? Why do you think that is, in your opinion?
I mean, like, what are we holding on to here, right? Like, what's guiding us? Is what's guiding us what society agrees on? Like, well, what about the experts? What about the people that study their whole lives on focusing on these issues and political, tops and turns and the history of genocide? If there's one thing that genocide experts have made clear from the very beginning of the post-October 7th context is that they do not happen in a vacuum, and they do not happen suddenly. Genocides are always built up to. The rhetoric to be able to dehumanize an entire population, to enable, to at least get by with as much destruction as possible, is a years and years, if not generations, in the making. So I think going back to kind of the original question here, which is like, what are we holding on to? Like, what are we really letting decide for us that we explore as journalists is, I don't know. It's strange to me, because why are we letting anyone determine what we think we should be reporting on? What we should be reporting on is the truth. We shouldn't be looking to be objective so as not to offend an aggressor, or so as not to accuse an aggressor of something they may or may not have committed. But that pursuit of objectivity has really violated an even more fundamental aspect of journalism, which is truth-telling, because I do believe that there are enough statements out there that so many pop-up news organizations, and Dropsite included, and other nonprofits that have popped up in the last 2 years, like the Hind Rajab Foundation, there is more than enough evidence out there of Israeli officials across the board making statements of intent to genocide, making statements of intent. So I saw kind of like an extra step of carefulness to protect Israel and its image than I even saw from Israel, from the Western media sphere. How or why they chose to make these decisions is beyond me. I truly do not understand it. I will never understand it, because we have two things that guide us as journalists. We have the journalistic process, which is to rely on others that know more than us and better than us to do the explaining. It's our choice of who we elevate and who we choose to speak to. Yes, that's for sure. And in that venture, it should be our responsibility to make sure that we are pursuing the truth in the best fashion that we can. And that is fully explaining what we are seeing from an aggressor side, that being Israel, as well as what the experts are saying. I have seen the same figures say over and over and over again that what they're witnessing in Gaza is a genocide and an ethnic cleansing. And for some reason, their fame and their platforms were mostly on social media. We're mostly on independent channels. We're mostly on pages that were curating news about Palestine. It didn't come from the Western media. And I think the Western media did itself a huge disservice, because they've diluted their own authority. Audiences crave to be heard. They crave to be listened to. And so in that quote that you read to me, if we're waiting on society to all be on the same page, that's not going to happen. But if we care about society so much, then why weren't we looking to the audience that was craving better news coverage of Palestine? So it's such a contradiction and such a confusing thought if you even try to attempt to understand what leadership was trying to go for during this past period. It's just a failure in every sense of the word.
something that I want to talk about was like this, how people perceive language, right? When people say, oh, like Western media outlets have used sort of passive language, they refuse to cover or report on these genocidal statements. In your opinion, what are the real world harms of the media covering these conflicts, as they call it, the way they have?
And for one, the world did not intervene. And I don't know that it would have been different, to be honest with you. We'll never know what could have been different based on media coverage, but the world did not intervene at the beginning of this genocide because I don't think that people understood the real stakes of what was going on to Palestinians. I remember writing a story about why so many children in Gaza in specific were being killed. The answer was that it's a very highly concentrated area and that the bombs and the missiles and arms used on this very concentrated area would obviously have like a high casualty count for wherever it struck. That and Gaza was already one of the most densely populated. I can't even imagine. I would need to do the reporting to understand how much more densely populated it is now. But at the time, before the mass displacement, was one of the most densely populated places in the world. In the process of reporting that, I was pushed to sort of include that the reason that Israel is bombing Gaza now is because of Hamas, and Hamas plays a role in why children are being killed. That it's not enough to say that Israel is killing children. You also have to put blame and make sure that the actions of somebody that's not actively attacking the children of Gaza is put in the story. And in these kind of battles, in these behind the scenes battles, you have to make concessions to get the story out. You know, the journalist needs to sort of have a discussion with themselves and with their own ethical board of like, okay, what matters more, winning this conversation or getting this story out? Or, okay, I need to make sure that I want to win this battle because that's something I'm absolutely not okay with. So I'm going to allow this or that line, or I'm going to make a suggestion here that kind of tempers the mood of whatever editor I'm working with at the time. So let's talk about real world harm. We have diluted the truth of what was happening. If there were any mechanisms in place to intervene in Gaza, if there was anything to charge people to act stronger, act faster, to illuminate for government members abroad, those that are arming Israel, that are now taking arms embargoes and protecting flotillas that are trying to break the siege, the actions that we are seeing from governments now could have come earlier if the truth of the matter, if the full picture was provided. If we were publishing the potential war crimes by Israeli soldiers that they were publishing themselves on social media, if we fully reported them, if we had full investment as this being the biggest priority of what we are covering, then I do think that the world would have responded differently. The world is responding now because there are so many actions that are, well, first of all, everybody's declared that it was a genocide. Any possible body in the world that could make the determination determined that it's now genocide. But we didn't need to wait for the situation to be in the most dire, worst possible scenario, apocalyptic, truly, to be able to intervene. We could have done that much sooner because to get here, it needed to start somewhere. Where it started, we did not tell the full picture.
In an interview with Columbia Journalism Review in August 2025 about urgent ideas for defending press freedom in Gaza, you outlined the ways in which Western media had betrayed its own rules and guidelines around fairness, accuracy, conflict of interest, equity, and so on. I want us to take each line one by one. We'll start with this, your words. In Gaza, journalists from Western outlets have shaped ongoing conflicts in favor of one party and giving cushion to perpetrators, which is a betrayal of the norm of fairness. Talk me through this.
This is something, by the way, that I also blame the U.S. administration for kind of giving the meat for journalists to kind of run with, which is Joe Biden cast doubt on the numbers of the Ministry of Public Health in Gaza for the casualty count, which means that Israel could kind of get away with killing so many more people because we don't actually believe the number being given to us by the local government in Gaza, which is ridiculous because this isn't the first war in Gaza and this isn't the first incursion that Israel has had. It's not the first occupation of Gaza. And Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the New York Times, there are so many huge fundamental bodies of record that have always trusted those numbers, that have never seen a deviance that was significant enough to determine that the Ministry of Public Health was ever giving wrong numbers. So to kind of copycat and imitate and parrot these false, bogus allegations over and over and over again really gives so much cushion to Israel to continue to perpetrate crimes against the Palestinian people. Unnoticed, uncovered, and even if you were then it's too late. Everybody already kind of doubts the numbers and the sources you're using. So it kind of poisoned credible sources for journalists to be able to use along the way. And again, it comes down to the bravery of a newsroom and an editorial decision to say, you know what, we've never had issues with this number before. We could include that in our reporting, that the Biden administration falsely claimed that this is not a credible organization or a credible body to listen to, but that wasn't the case. And so it's a mixture of parroting, omitting, and not really being brave enough to seek the truth, to kind of like fall in line of any intimidation tactics that the U.S. administration was kind of waging against journalists, kind of implying to them, is one way. Another way is that there were so many strikes that were just simply not covered. You know, right now we have in September 2025, it's not an official count, but it is a count by some respected doctors that the true death toll may be 680,000 people. We're talking about this from a population of 2.3 million. You know, I'll let the numbers kind of speak for themselves. We did not cover that. We did not cover the rising toll. We did not cover exactly how deadly this war has been. We stuck to, all of a sudden, even though there's this organization that we no longer trust because the Biden administration and so many other news outlets have said that it's a Hamas-run agency, we don't trust these numbers. And somehow, when it stopped counting because all of the infrastructure failed and was totally destroyed in Gaza, we are only relying on the number that we still have from a year and a half ago, which is the number that stopped at 60,000. How? How did we get from 60,000 to 680,000? How did that happen in a blink of an eye? How did this happen without us being able to even count to 80, 100, 150? How did we not get there? Because we weren't covering it. And this omission, this lack of commitment to covering the rising death toll in Gaza is truly, truly a failure of Western media. You know, we play such a role in shaping ongoing conflicts. Over the last 2 years, there have been, 2 Pulitzer Prize cycles, 2 award cycles. There have been how many newsrooms that have received awards for reporting on Gaza? Obviously, we can track impact. Obviously, we see that newsrooms have impact if this is the kind of thing that they're getting awarded for. So obviously, we have impact in shaping ongoing conflicts. I've said before publicly, and I will say it again, that if media is only parroting the talking points of the nations with superior arms, they're tools of war. They're not independent reporting.
Something else that you said in that piece as well, this is something that I don't think gets reported on enough, even though I've seen so many examples of it where, you know, outlets employing active Israeli military affiliated people as reporters without disclosures is a betrayal of the norm or conflict of interest and feeds into other professional violations. And I'm just thinking, if we talk about neutrality and objectivity, we hire people like this who have sworn allegiance, patriotism, and are being paid by the government as actively prosecuting a war. Make it make sense, basically, you know?
Yeah, I mean, even if they're not actively being paid anymore, even if they're not active members, which, by the way, we don't even know what those statistics are like because we don't know the reality of how many have some sort of IDF affiliation, whether that's current, reserve, or past, or with Israeli prisons. We simply don't know. This is not to say that these people cannot also then become journalists. They can become journalists if they want to. They can be hired by newsrooms, but that has to be disclosed. You know, there have been so many scandals in the last couple of, you know, I would say in like the last 10 years in journalism about whether or not somebody married to somebody in the U.S. government can then even report on politics or report on Congress. And some of these things that have come to light have been, you know, widely scrutinized. So why is that not the case with Gaza? Why is that not the case with Israel? Those that have ties to a country that is engaging in active warfare be seen as those that can't be objective, if objective is the point, or at least like have a conflict of interest. There have been a lot of journalists that have kind of been sidelined as main reporters or lead reporters for having their personal stances of Palestine, those that have had to self-censor on their social media channels, those that have had to be very careful with what they've reposted, and even those that have absolutely no affiliation to the Arab world whatsoever for having once signed a letter asking that journalists in Gaza be protected, be considered too biased and too involved to be able to report on the subject. So it's a very obvious double standard that's being applied to one party and not the other. And this obviously affects coverage. These are the same newsrooms hiring and employing these people to lead coverage that had a public reckoning in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter protests across the United States to say that those that occupy our newsrooms change the direction of our reporting. They make it richer. They bring perspectives we wouldn't have access to. They share and educate in a way that's necessary if we're going to connect with audiences and communities. And so why is that not seen with Arab journalists, with Palestinian journalists? Why is that same consideration and reckoning not offered? Why is it instead clamped down on? I mean, those that were even part of the BLM movement or part of the idea of improving racial coverage in the United States might also tell you that it wasn't a sincere movement. Years later, there are so many jobs that have been nixed from newsrooms. NPR, unfortunately, as much as I like NPR, has essentially, when they decided to shave down their entire podcast department, got rid of most of the shows that were related to diversity and representing minority voices. And so really the commitment was not strong. If it wasn't strong, then you kind of have to question whether or not it was ever truly sincere. But we know for certain that newsrooms have failed before when it comes to representing minority voices. Minority, I don't know if even that's the right word, majority voices. And they're failing again.
On the list of the things that you mentioned, was probably, I think, the gravest thing is, newsrooms who are sort of like misrepresenting or omitting major events from coverage altogether, airstrikes, starvation, Israeli declarations of intent to commit genocide and prevent distribution of aid, demonstrates inequitable editorial decision-making, and facilitates what is now a genocide. If you could speak more about that, and if you find Western media outlets responsible for how far we have come.
We have cast doubt. Well, I'm not going to include myself in that. The Western media has cast doubt on numbers. The Western media has cast down on the legitimate credibility of journalists in Gaza, both by insisting that foreign journalists need to be inside in order for us to, quote unquote, get the truth, rather than rely on their expertise and their knowledge and their work. They have repeated claims that such journalists could have been associated with Hamas, even though that is not true. And nobody has been brave enough to question whether or not even simply stating that somebody is a terrorist makes them a legitimate target for killing. Because even in the UN framework of counterterrorism, every human being, first and foremost, has the right to life, and secondly, has the right to due process. So for a journalist to be cast as a terrorist does not mean they are a legitimate target for killing. When we have seen in the past 5 years the entire media apparatus go out of their way to campaign for the release of a journalist from jail in Russia or anywhere else, we don't see even a single condemnation for the killing and slaughtering in the most brutal of ways. We're talking decapitation. We're talking people being shot and left to bleed dry. When we're not even moved by the murder of our own colleagues, then we have failed. And we continue to fail in the documentation of what is a genocide. We have allowed it to happen. Part of being a journalist is not being so robotic and unmoved by the suffering of people. It is to be moved by the suffering of people. It is to capture what is going on with them, what they are suffering, what are they going through. And our colleagues are suffering and going through exactly what the Palestinian people are. They are civilians like other people are. They are at-risk civilians. They are people that have a target on their back for wearing a press sign. So when we don't believe them, when we don't air their coverage, when we don't pay them fairly, when we don't rely on them to give us the truest picture of what is happening on the ground, we are aiding and abetting in their people's suffering. We have the resources. There is the attention. There is the hunger for understanding what was happening in Gaza these past 2 years, and the West Bank for that matter, which is a completely forgotten about war in and of itself. We had more than enough to be able to tell the truth of what was going on in Gaza, and we did not. So I don't know how to perceive this in any other way than the Western media having played a role in the cover-up of a genocide.
This episode of In Solidarity was presented and produced by Ayodeji Rutinwa. Additional production work was by James Basil. The theme song is Odyssey by Edward Abella. Additional audio clips are from the Boston Globe, Al Jazeera Plus, the UN Palestinian Rights Committee, and SBS News. If you enjoyed today's episode and would like to help support us in making more of those, you can do so by visiting openDemocracy.org. openDemocracy.net/donate. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.